Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to Carmine's Arena, a cultural gourmet of information, if you will, a feast for your mind and soul. And now, without further delay, the man, the myth, the maestro, Carmine Arena.
Greetings and welcome once again to Carmine's Arena, site of contest and conflict, venue for and of resolution. Resolution in terms of focus, remedy, and commitment, both yours and mine, to the preservation, the propagation, and indeed the celebration of Western civilization. Our contradictions, our compartmentalized lives make for man's everyday mischief and eternal marvels. Mischief and marvels, our monstrosity and miracles, are amusingly and memorably depicted in civilization's dramatic tragedies, comedies, and opera. Our mischief and marvels are realized in great and gripping literature, or brought to us in speech song via the likes of Chaucer, as in Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, Dante's Divine Comedy, Milton's Paradise Lost, and long before all of the above, man's contradictions and deceptions were brought to pulsating life by none other than the blind poet Homer of ancient Greece in his epics, the Iliad and the Odyssey. All the above-cited masterpieces contain a trove of human conduct and characters, within which are to be found the conflicting currents of both mischief and marvels. One moment man, the very next instant monster. Yes, paradoxically, the two polarities, frequently found in one and the same skin of twin within origins, from Adam to all the other human amalgams. Read correctly, why even Milton had the bravery and insight to foster a degree of unexpected sympathy for Satan in Paradise Lost. Satan, who was once favored, displaced by Adam, and becoming that malcontent who with temerity argues on equal terms with God himself. The trove of characters of which I speak are redoubled and, yes, even trebled in the deathless plays and odes of William Shakespeare. This man, one hell of a marvel. Not to mention his special mystery, magic, miracle, and mirth, and imagination, which has saturated cultures the world over. Diversity itself integrated enthusiastically into customs, culture, stories, and song, all in each seized by the glorious Stratford genius of the bard's arts. Said arts give us the right and the obligation to taking care of the world by the enrichment of its inhabitants, spiritually, emotionally, socially, intellectually, and physically. Art justifiably gives its great ones the singular right to depart from reality in order to convey from its fabulous fabrications a far bigger truth. At no other time is this partnership between art and man become more imperative, because throughout the world today the mischief of the monstrous must give us significant pause to gather strength and resources to combat any who willingly or unknowingly champion the tyranny of ignorance and its ugliness. Thus man is the tale of two manifestations. One cozies up to marvel, the other clings to monstrosity. The former, marvels that is, come in infinite variety, whereas the uncreative blandness of mischief graduated to evil, when properly examined, reveals itself as utterly repetitive and unimaginative. And since the beginning of recorded history, evil has wrought nothing but initial destruction. thereafter evil becoming the placeholder for the unfolding of chaos ever after. 'Tis time we zero in on the mischief of ignorance born of false knowledge. In fact, nothing in all the world is more dangerous, said Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr., than sincere ignorance and conscientious stupidity. Those few powerful thoughts crush the arrogance of race baiters and jihadists and puts both in the same pile. Unfortunately, that pile is recyclable in the absence of vigilance. That is indeed why it is that constructs like the Taliban and the likes of ISIS must be iced, spliced, diced with all those other Islamo-shams reduced to beggar lice. Winston Churchill, an oracle, and a man never quite honored to the degree he so roundly merited, had this to say, and I quote, "The truth is utterly incontrovertible. Malice may attack it, ignorance may deride it, but in the end, there it is," unquote. And one other timely quote from Sir Winston I can't resist. "Socialism," said Churchill, "is a philosophy of failure, the creed of ignorance and the gospel of envy. Its inherent virtue is the equal sharing of misery." Small wonder that the first mischievous act of President Obama was to return to the British a bust of Churchill given years ago to the White House, and so presently we share in our misery. A misery leftists invariably blame on Bush, who lived comfortably with Laura at the White House, while Churchill's bronzed visage remained admiringly in place. President Obama, an unfortunate and inveterate narcissist, can't abide icons, especially when they don't agree with his well-trumpeted but stunted worldview. Socialism was and is a failure as long as ignorance and envy abide in the human mind and self-righteous heart. Yet secular progressives continue to imagine they've fallen upon the necessary correctives. Yet, after all is said and drummed of this balmy Obama-rama, the correctives are naught but new wine in old bottles, innovation in rotation by bloviation. Speaking of ignorance, we need only reach out again to the Middle East and its other clone zones to view the consequences of blind and, in this case, bone-crippling ignorance. Pakistan, which boasts of its nuclear capacity tamed only by its perceived enemy, India, has forsaken a long-ago cure for polio, which has been literally wiped out throughout planet Earth. Wiped out save for the wretchedness of self-imposed mischief become monstrous in the hands of those in nihilistic governance of Pakistan, who frustrate the distribution and use of the polio vaccine. The results have been devastating. Arguments against the drug suggest that it is considered a covert method of sterilization hosted by their enemies. You know, the satanic infidel. Another argument proscribes the use of said vaccine because humanitarians who've come to Pakistan to immunize the population are nothing more than infiltrating enemy agents. Thus, a virus again triumphs over human ignorance gone viral unto error and superstition. There is, my friends, no marvel in the latter deadly trio which continues to battle, even with innocence, armed with their ignorance, error, and superstition. The Taliban, who finds home and refuge in this region, also with impudence and impunity gleefully toss acid in the faces of schoolgirls, because God calls upon girls to forsake learning. Also, these unspeakable Taliban have been known to retaliate mortally against those caught making music at weddings. Wedding music, traditional and centuries old, common to the region. Can you imagine believing this travesty if you were reading fiction? The medieval mind, it has been noted, requires that you do not need a body, except that is to strap on modern explosives, to kill and maim indiscriminately, then be gloriously subsumed on high to cavort with 70-some-odd full-bodied virgins. Yet what is promised to female suicide bombers, may we ask? Well, of course, it now occurs to me that they'll be among the virgins. For you see, if you're a female, you must still lose something. To the militant Muslim female, not even heaven offers hope of anything gained except the displacement of self-authority and a natural death. Therefore, in the Middle East, an Islamic Adam favored over Satan would give a modern Milton endlessly riotous material. Why, such a Milton could even get material daily in so-called reality television shows where setups are endlessly rehearsed and properly lighted and mic'd. Fiction thus becomes stranger than truth, even though a stranger to truth. Ah, yes, there is no end to man's mischief. Yes, but that polio vaccine which was referenced earlier is no mischief, but indeed a marvel that has protected countless millions by thwarting crippling infection. It is heartening to ponder the marvelously long list of infections, once deadly, that man has conquered, and then quickly zero in on the Muslim fundamentalists who behead vaccinators and humanitarians, who could have remained stateside and gone to the movies instead, and enjoyed candy and or popcorn, and perhaps stolen a kiss. Come to think of it, in some quarters a stolen kiss can get a girl stoned to death. These kiss of death medievalists who don't want a body have become rigmarole modernists, and as such also don't want a soul. Such, my dear listeners, is our enemy, and as such deserves our best in order to accomplish their worst. Truth to tell, after much is said and done, the dirty deed in man's mischief is his long unspoken fear, the fear of freedom. For our free will, when squandered, has consequences. Since we now believe, in all too many quarters, that there be no consequences, there nonetheless are. We cannot stay reality's habit of keeping record and holding us to account. Hence, for protection, we herd. We don't mind being a groupthink society with the political correctness police to monitor our intellection, an intellection generated by the criminal syndicate called education, and our drive-by media, leftist bandits and entitlement junkies all. The we know better rabble who'd prefer a bust of Karl Marx in the White House in place of Churchill. Karl Marx, a high liver who lived off of his wife and friends lifelong, and fathered an illegitimate son he never saw, nor wanted anything to do with. So much for his social justice and love of mankind. All abstractions that don't need diapering, but could sure use a cold shower. Karl Marx and his political descendants hate capitalism because it works, much like our Taliban splinter groups who kill polio vaccinators and rail against immunization as dangerous to health and against Islam. You see, it works. But the power of such conspiracy theories has been diminished by hundreds of millions of dollars in donations from Gulf countries and Islamic organizations towards successful immunization campaigns. Thus, these medieval theories and mindless attacks are just another way to challenge authority, as polio surges ahead carried by refugees who are presently crossing borders fleeing terror in North Waziristan and Afghanistan. Misery always begets company and blankets disease. Imagine this ignorance of diseased minds and bodies finding that peace that our very own leftist community assures us will emerge once we withdraw all military forces from the region. Yet again, another fairy tale which impales the truth. Meanwhile, the region has gone nuclear, Iran doubtless to follow, having witnessed already the West failing with North Korea's realized ambitions. Now let's leave behind the polio peccadillo as a self-explanatory imbroglio and move on further into man's tale of two manifestations. For the moment we'll forego man's mischief, his high crimes and misdemeanors, and dwell for a spell on his motto, to minstrel, ignoring the brothel, the shrapnel, and the scoundrel to treble, but man's undying marvels to novel, if but in tiny morsels to model. It has been observed the man who thinks he can and the man who thinks he cannot are both right. Which one are you? To be yourself in a world that is constantly trying to make you less is a very significant achievement. It is humbling for a case in point to dwell on the likes of Helen Keller, who said, "Optimism is the faith that leads us to achievement. Nothing can be done without hope and confidence." This glorious statement from Miss Keller, who was shut out from the world by blindness and deafness, but nonetheless was eagerly invited into our world to instruct any enamored of our victimhood. Do yourselves a favor and read Keller's essay upon hearing Beethoven. His music was sensed from the vibrations it created, and those in turn she felt. Talk about human marvel. Listening in a subsensory manner to a deaf composer's music, a soundscape whose legacy has been lifted into space by a time capsule, which, if ever recovered by an alien, will be decodified to invoke a warm respect for us earthlings. Yes, my dear listeners, read Keller's moving words describing her experience of a radio performance of Beethoven's imperishable Ninth Symphony. Then ask yourself, what have I been missing? Do I deliberately use my senses, or do I take these gifts much too lightly? Perhaps it is well time for each of us to put on our decoder ring, if only to view the world again as a child perforated by curiosity. A child who can more easily imagine superheroes. Talk about codes and the breaking of same brings us to man's mischief and marvels, but this time with mischief being inflicted upon marvel. The marvel is the recognized father of computer science, Alan Turing, in whose honor is given the prestigious A.M. Turing Award, a prize called the Nobel Prize of Computing. His breaking the German Enigma code, considered impenetrable, saved thousands of lives during World War II. His mathematical genius earlier led to the publishing of a paper in 1937, introducing the idea that a hypothetical device could come up with a solution to any problem that is computable. It is hard to imagine today the mischief become monstrosity perpetrated on this hero who played a key role in Germany's defeat and unconditional surrender. This superhero, with a child's curiosity, was later punished for the then perceived crime of homosexuality. This astonishing codebreaker was subjected to chemical castration, only to be pardoned 60 years later by royal decree. 2 years after the castration, which Turing chose in order to avoid a custodial sentence, he ended his life at the age of 41 by eating an apple laced with cyanide. His fantastic war record and legacy to science reduced to man's habitual ingratitude and hideous self-righteousness. You would have thought that merry old England would have learned better after what was callously done to their genius, that other genius, Oscar Wilde, a few decades before. This incomparable man of letters and singular wit, who was sentenced to hard labor for the crime of homosexuality, a love that dare not speak its name. The harsh treatment of his sentence resulting in his premature death at 46. Alas, man's mischief has a genius for killing genius. Germany did it via Hitler, Russia via Stalin, Spain via Franco, Cuba via Castro. It is worth noting that in the Middle East, for example, Iran, homosexuality has been declared non-existent and a weakness found only among non-Muslim men in the satanic West. Such be machismo gone from macabre to meshuggah. Not to mention rockin' Morocco. Shh, we'll leave it at that. I shall say no more. Well, as I've said at the outset of this episode, our contradictions, our compartmentalized lives make for man's everyday mischief and eternal marvels. Our perspectives, a combo of accusing, confusing, suffusing, and unfailingly amusing views, which brings to mind the many riotously comic moments notated again by Oscar Wilde when recounting his visit to America, where he admitted liking our girls, but not their mothers. One particular moment stands out in my memory from his whimsical travelogue. He was invited to dinner by a Southern gentleman in the Deep South. During dinner, he lamented to Wilde his sadness of their having lost the war to the Yanks. After dinner, the two repaired to the veranda to smoke cigars. I wonder if they were Cuban. At this juncture, Wilde looked up at the night sky and commented on the beauty of the moon. "Ah," said the gentleman host, "you should have seen it before the war, Mr. Wilde." I can't help wondering what this rebel would have said were he even capable of imagining our one day walking on the moon's dark side. Now that's a marvel. I still can't get over, though in a manner of speaking, poets and painters and musicians took possession of that changing sphere long before we trod upon it. Think of that. We owned it before we walked on it, thanks to art and artists and imagination, human imagination. Lovers today who are separated by long distances can still look up and share an appointed shining moment of being once again together. Now that is marvelous. Till next time, my friends, keep the faith. Keep out of mischief, or you'll be levied a tariff by yours truly. Instead, use your imagination. Why, it's even made some your memorable pontiff. Ta-ta.
If you have any comments or other remarks, and that I perhaps could even read on some of these broadcasts, please do not hesitate to write to me, Carmine Arena, P.O. Box 1029, Larchmont, New York 10538.